And good morning, everybody. David Cross. I have, I think, one more update on this Windows 2012-2016 conversion utility. Got quite a bit resolved this weekend, and I think, like with the MAC address program that I was writing, that I have a core app that now works that I can start transforming, at least in the ways that I need to, and fitting this into the web and/or in areas that can be accessed. So let me go over just a couple real quick things on this. I think that this will probably be the last video for a while as I kind of work out all of the code cleanup and making sure I have all my routines. But I've kind of identified the core areas that I need to work on, my next steps in this, and thought I'd give you a real quick show of what's going on. So I have added basically a upload page where I can now, through the web client, select my files that I'm looking to convert and upload those with an email address that then gets processed. So it gets uploaded to the server, then gets processed through the Node-RED. And what I expect to have at the end of this process is a converted file set that has all of the, in this case, IP control import formats. And there was our payload, there goes our email. And then in this email, I should have 3 different files that I can work through. And so in the first thing that we did, recalling back, is we had our scopes. And in the scope CSV, we had the import format for IP control child blocks that identify the subnets that are utilized within this configuration file. And also, I've added a few other things, such as the IP integer translation, so that I can sort this on a IP address, basically on its integer conversion. And then it has all of the specific fields and default values that we can use and then replace or just remove as we need to based on what that, in this case, again, IP control architecture looks like to import this. Now, the reason we're doing this, to kind of backtrack for those who are interested in the IP control format, is we're doing this so that you can convert this information offline, where we wouldn't have access per se to an IP control instance that was already configured with DHCP discovery abilities. And so we would be looking at taking this information offline, perhaps in a proof of concept, or even through an implementation where we would pre-process the data, import it, and through our professional services perhaps, or through your own services, migrate this instance into an IP control database. So that's our goal. And we want the ability to do this quickly and also efficiently without errors and with some type of level of confidence in the value that we're getting back here. Now, also to note too, if you had watched this process, it didn't take really even a minute to say to upload the file and get the results. And again, this was processing right around 2,500 subnets and a little over 12,000 reservations. So it's still quite complex. And a few other things that I've done in this application, and we're going to go over this, is in the IP control, in the IP device files, I've added a number of checks when I go through the data to verify the type of IP address, whether the MAC address is a valid MAC address, at least by length, let's say, and by the number of characters. And if it's not, I wanted to make some type of deterministic decisions about what to do in terms of both the type of address, meaning if it was a valid DHCP MAC address and it had a valid name, that I would pull this in as a manual DHCP device. And where I had perhaps a MAC address that was invalid because it cannot be assigned to a DHCP device without a valid MAC address, I converted it to static. However, that could be a reservation in this case. And I also had added in some of the descriptive information where I started modifying some of the files that I was adding in some details about what the changes were, what the information looked like in its previous state, and so on. So I've got a number of things that I've done with this information that I hope would be useful as well as we move forward with the naming and that convention. And then lastly, I still have to get to the options, but in the options CSV, we're going to still break that out and start building out some import templates that will kind of be that latter step in my kind of final phase of this application. All right, so that's how that works. And as you saw, that was very efficient. And I can sit here and do this all day long, and it seems to work very well. Now, what I need to do, of course, at this point, I think, is I need to start to think about multi-tenancy, building out arrays for the incoming messages and ways that I can look up the sessions and things to make sure that there's no conflict, or setting up through subscribers and other capabilities. So still a bit to go through, but let me take a step back and kind of go where we started with here. So the first thing is my global changes. I found that I needed to have these functions that I'm creating and I was putting down into the function nodes. I wanted these to be globally available, and I want them to be part of this application that I'm looking to deploy. So I am effectively now, when I'm creating these functions, setting up their variable and storing those into the global variable space that I can then create a local variable which references that function and then call that function locally in the local flow. And that gives me this global function or global access to this as I desired. I did that with the mask decider to mask. And I also went back and did this with the particular block structure. Since this is a known structure, I went ahead and kind of created this as a constant variable or object type. So I'm building out the block structure and then working through and setting up each individual value. Now let me go through this slowly for anybody that's looking through this or following along kind of with the code. Now these fields are based on IP control 10.0. They are based on the CLI import formats, and the block structure as defined here should be in field or column order as to the import format that we're going to return into the import CSV files. Now, once you're done with this and setting up your structure and your global for that, like in this case, my block, you can do it with anything, make sure that you set those values. And this is how we set it into the global variable space so that we can later get that information and then update it. And we're going to do the same thing with the IP structure. So now that we're processing IP addresses, I'm also creating an IP structure device, and I'm going to reference at that particular junction in the scripts. And I'm going to return that based on the value set. So this will return the default space, and then in the local flow, I can control, manipulate, or add additional parameters to this list. Lastly, again, setting this up into its global function space. And then for the headers, so that I could, in the CSV output, create the first row as a header, so that as you're opening that up, you can see the reference to the columns and what those fields represent. And of course, for me to map that and align it, I also just created a string header, which was comma delimited, which included the IP integer column. So it's a little, I added that especially for this. And just allows me to set it. So if you're creating these structures or headers, this is where I set it, and then I later pull it down into the flow. All right? So this is a global function again. And what I want with this is I want it to be available every time it loads the flow. So I inject it at least once to make sure that those are set within the global space. All right, so that was the first thing I did in the change. The second thing is I went out and set up another rule, which I found that as I was monitoring these new files, at the end of the flow where I create the files, there's nothing to do until those files are determined to be written, and the next part of the step is to get those files, make sure they're attached, and then to delete them when they're done. So unfortunately, the flow from the start of the import file to the capture of the new files being written, there's a break. There's nothing passing this information of the message from the previous input into the next output. So I had really, I know this way, I kind of broke my own process where I couldn't identify the file name, and I wanted that file name further down in the process so that I could delete those and make sure that it cleaned up after itself. So the one thing I did is I injected, because I know that in the file watcher it sets the file name. So I set a flow to cur file name. Not a good place to put it if you're going to do this in duplicate. So I have to work on this, but I had to do it for this process at least to get to the next part. And then what I wanted to do, and I think I'm going to use this a little bit further, but set the message topic to also the file name so that in the debug messaging I can see which file is being referenced, and so forth. Now, when I upload these, I think I'll work through a process that when I create the files, it'll create a special temp file so it can't be duplicated, and that each one of these flows would have its own. It'll be in an array, and we'll select which ones are active and so forth. So I'll have a process that will do this at some point. But here, I set the flow to the current name and from the message file name, and topic to the message file name as well. Our file gets processed, XML is still the same. We then set the payload for the scopes, and then down into our function, which at this point is a little bit cleaner. I still have a number of areas to clean up and decisions to make here. No changes, at least from our previous video, in terms of just setting up the different arrays that we're going to reference to. But what is different is that now that we have these different functions set up as variables in the global space, I want to set up a local flow variable that references those functions so that I can call them, the method, locally in the flow and get those values. And so now I'm using, as the example, the file system context, global get file system. Then I have the get CIDR, the new block, and the new IP structures that are in that global space. So I went ahead and brought those down into local variables that I'm going to reference soon. And then I also brought down the headers, which I'm going to immediately push into the first data element of the array to make sure that when I create this CSV output, that is the first line in our output file. So that was pretty seamless. And then as I move down a little bit further, we start going through our loop again. And we first start off again in our scope. And this is where I need to kind of decide, do I want to use the memory to create an object just simply to reference that object again through a different object? And so I'm kind of duplicating things. That will have to change because it's just a memory hog. But I'm doing it for now just to reference it and because it works for now, and then I'll clean it up. But the idea again is I want to create a scope. I want to pull out just the values I want. Again, not having to pull in the whole scope and all of the reservations and options and so forth. And then make that a CSV string that I'm going to store up into a scope CSV array. Now, moving further down, I'm going to call, specify the subnet mask, so pulling that out from the CSV that I'm processing or the XML I'm processing. And now I'm going to call that global function that I pulled down into the get CIDR variable. So now, because it's a function, we reference it as a function, passing it the net mask, and it then runs that in a local space. So now I'm going to create another structure, which is the block. I then go in and create get the size and the address, and then build out the block name, which I'm doing in code right now. And I could probably change a lot of this, put it up into standard nodes, which in the end I think will be the way that will work. But here I'm going to go ahead and programmatically do the name concatenation here. Now I also wanted to make sure I had the block in, so I set up that IP integer function, which works on a subnet as well as a network as well as an IP address for IPv4 addresses. So it works on anything that's a quad dot notation there. So next thing I then was to create a CSV file for this line. And so the IP blocks line, when we get to it, is really what I'm going to use as the import line. So I'm storing that into the array, and then I'm just running through the next for loop, which again, I'm doing nothing in the options at this point, but if you freeze this, you can actually capture the code. And then I am processing down to the reservations. Now, I just did a lot of this code change this morning early, and wanted to get this out because I'm going to be busy this week and may not have a chance. But more specifically, again, I moved the IP functions back up into its global space. I'm using the IP integer locally, which I had previously. And I'm doing a couple things differently here in terms of the name, the description, and the MAC address for checks. So first of all, what I wanted to do is capture the name and then run a regex against that name to ensure it's compatible at least with a DNS name. And so the thing I had previously was a regex that was effectively everything to the right of this open square bracket, backslash capital S, a plus sign, close square bracket, asterisk. So I added this in that if there's any spaces, that it's invalid, all right? And everything else it double checks to make sure of that syntax. Now, in that valid name regex, I couldn't get it to check on a single line, or just got lazy and didn't do it. I will. But I made sure that it was capturing the name first, and then I went through and verified it was doing a match in the additional space. So for some reason, I couldn't get the space to check properly here. So I put an additional check down into the function where I did match the string, and I'm going to modify this too. But the intent was to put all in the regex, but I had to do it down here as well, and that will change. But the one thing I'm doing is when I capture that there is a space, and because that is invalid, I'm setting up the description now to have a pound, whatever the description currently is with a pound, the current name that we determined to be invalid, and then an end pound so that somebody going through this could still see what the original name was and then work with that data further to make some determination. Didn't want to get rid of the information because it is used as a documentation tool. So we want to make sure we capture it. And then as I move down further, because of this valid host name check, that if it's not valid, that it would come down and say that it's invalid and do the apply naming policy, again setting the description. So there was kind of an if statement with an outer if statement. And then I'm going down further with the MAC address. So the differences I had here is I set up the MAC regex to be of a regex type, passing it in a regular expression that matches the MAC address. Now I know that in the initial MAC address it has a hyphen, so I'm only using it as the delimiter capability there. And here I'm also going to match that the length of this MAC address, because I expect it to have the hyphen delimiter, is going to be 17 characters. It should be exactly 17. It could probably be 17 or greater, but I'm going to rest on 17 as being safe. RAS servers and some things might append to 16. It might be 24 or something, but you're not going to really see that. So I'm going to stay with 17 for now, but that may change as well. And then here what we're doing is that once I've determined that this is valid, I'm going to go ahead and just strip out the hyphen and set, in this case, the hardware type is Ethernet. Now, if you're using token ring, there's a whole other process here. I'm going to assume you're doing Ethernet. We could change this. And because it has a valid MAC address and is coming from the reservations file, we're going to call this a manual-DHCP or m-DHCP address type. Otherwise, this is an invalid DHCP device because the MAC address is not valid. And so we want to unset the hardware type. We do not, if it expects that if this is set to Ethernet, that there is a corresponding MAC address import, and there's not. So we want to make sure that in this case it's changed. And we want to then set this to static, although we could do reservation as an option here. Lastly, we're going to get the type, which we're not using this, but this is both or DHCP in terms of how Microsoft uses that terminology. And then lastly, we're going to join the res string as a CSV and push it into the res CSV. But here's where we're going to build the IP address object, which we're going to pass into the IP CSV, which is what we expect in the output. And we're only going to change the values that we have information for that are different than the defaults. So as we get into this form upload, we might want to start inheriting values through the form so that we can set these values here through some other type of extraction of that. We'll go through that too. And then here I'm going to pass this up into the array. So that was really the change in the IP addresses. And then all the rest of this information in terms of how it creates a string is all the same. I'm just simply writing this out. I did set this up as asynchronous now. So I'm watching this. I'm not blocking the event loop any longer. It's actually putting this as a state that we're getting a callback for. And then in the callbacks of each of these, both error and others here, I'm at least clearing out the opcsv variable, just trying to try and save some space while it's in these functions, or memory, excuse me. And that's it. And that passes the end of that. And then the rest of this was effectively still the same. But in case there's any differences there, we have, we're just clearing out the payload. And then we have our mail header, which is just an email response string that we're attaching. And I'm pulling these values out of a global variable, which I'll show you in a minute as well. All right, so this is something that we'll need to change. And this will tie back into the session in the way that we track each session coming in, and that we separate the files, emails, and track that individually versus just kind of overriding each one. So that's where we're going to be in that kind of latter step of this in a complete product. And the other parts we're going to have in this particular function is I just created a global setting. I'm basically saying that in the flow, I want to set a, kind of a global variable that if it doesn't get set, that it at least goes somewhere just for now. And I'm calling this at least from the payload. Okay, so I'm going to show you the upload file now. It's really simple, and I'll let you see there. So now that that function is running, when we go through this upload page, we effectively have a /upload endpoint, which is just a get function. It then loads in a template file, which is the way that Node-RED allows you to construct, say, HTML in a template, and it uses the mustache templating for, say, Angular and others for inputting variables. So what we do here is I'm setting up a couple of H1, H2 tags, a standard HTML, and we're creating a form. And this form is going to call our next API endpoint, which is a post of upload_post, telling it the type and that it's a multi-part form data, and that we're going to select the type of file, and then through our file selection dialog boxes, we'll set the variable myFile, which we're going to later call. And I added then the email address as well that I want this to be referenced to, that will overwrite the global variable when it uploads the form. Okay. And then when the upload post comes in, we have to accept the accept file uploads for this process. When that request comes in, I'm then going to take the payload my email and set it into the global to email. I'm then going to set my email and the message as a whole nother, because I was debugging some of this, and also set that to this variable. And then lastly, the way that this form gets uploaded is the payload gets set to the request, the file 0, so the first file, and the buffer of it so that it can write out the buffer. And that's how it pulls in that file information. And you can actually see that and navigate down into, when you look at the request, you should see a payload of that request type, and in there you should see that functionality if you put the debug on. Now, when those rules are changed, I'm then running a function, and this function is then going to set the email here again in case it got lost. Again, I was just troubleshooting this. But what it does do here is it looks for a type image, and if it is an image, it sets the payload to a specific image source type. So it has to be set to base 64, and there's some changes that you apply here. Otherwise, it considers this to be a string, and will attempt to convert that string into the payload. Now, lastly, I'm not doing anything with that payload, and I don't even need to set that payload to that value. But there's two things that happen here. Let me show you the first. The first is I'm going to write out, and I have been writing out at least here, a static file. So this is basically saying you can have any name you want to, but when I write this, I want to generate a file that I know that I can pass forward, and that will most likely be dynamically generated with some type of ID or session ID. But right now I'm using server 2 because I know that it's there and I can manually process this. Again, that will change. And I'm, as an output of this, passing another template node, which is further allowing me to define, the success of the information, that it's coming, expect an email from a specific email address, and that it's going to be sent to a specific email as passed in on the form. And then, of course, if you'd like to contribute and support our efforts, everything's always welcome. So, again, as we publish this out there and we make this kind of, open source and working through it, we might want to have that it, works with so many accounts, or as an engineer, you might get so many options to convert, or, there might be some, way to collect some reimbursement fees, for the cost of doing this. So I don't know how that's going to work yet, but this is what I've got. And so far, this looks really good and has been doing what I need to do. And I wanted to share that with everybody, at least for that part. One more thing here, and some of the logic of testing the mailer at least, and when I started cleaning up these files, I found that if the file was still existing when another file of the same name was overloaded, like the server 2, it wouldn't do anything, it would just not process. And that's because I'm looking on a specific change type node where it's looking for a rename versus a change. And a change would mean the file's there and it's just updating the file, and I'm actually deleting and recreating it. So I need to make sure that it's not there when it goes and uploads the same file name. I had a hard time with trying to figure that out, so what I ended up with is I used the status node. And in the status node, I tracked it down just to the mailer but I think I'm going to use this for different parts of this product, and I'm going to track each with a switch node to monitor which status update I'm getting. This would be then the switch node. And what I'm checking for here specifically is a status text. Now, I probably need to have two switch nodes, one to say, what is the message type, which node is providing this message, and then for each message have an output that does a different check and potentially different layers of switches if I don't get into a function. This one's real easy. I just check for OK, and once I know that OK is done, that means that those files have been attached and sent to the remote SMTP server. It's been accepted and delivered. I then can go in and I set up a delete function which attempts to delete all these files. So again, I'm going out and getting the global context, setting it up for FS3, the local variable, and I'm looking into a directory, setting this for the complete. And here, I'm just telling it to go out and unlink the files for each of these files that I'm manually creating. Now, I'll need to do this again dynamically, so this will change, but for now, that works well. And then finally, I wanted to set up the cur file name, which if you recall, I set into the first change node, copying it up into the flow, which is not a good place, but that's where I put it. And for now, that's where it'll be until I modify that. And then lastly, I just want to generate a log that says, the file name that's generated here and everything was deleted. So in that log, I am going to get that information that says when the files are there, and I did this for debugging purposes. All right. So again, just to see that one more time, since it's very, very quick, it takes less than a minute, 2,500 subnets, a little over 12,000 IP devices. I don't expect that the options will be much longer since I'm already processing it, probably less. And I hope in the email that we can make this available at least as a service that might run on your local enterprise. And that way, you can do a lot of other things. We can start doing some IP control checks and others, and we can start looking through some other things. So that's it. And I thank you for hanging out again with me for another 30-minute video. I apologize for that. But I think I'm going to stop this particular series at this video. Focus on finishing this when I have time, but I've got some other projects I need to get back to. And in the end, though, I think that I'll have a solid product that I can release kind of as an open source, allowing you to download the flow to make it as generic as possible for you. So anyway, again, thanks for bearing with me, and I hope somebody's finds this useful in terms of how Node-RED works and how some of these functions can work for you to help you automate this. And I will tell you one last thing where I'm going with this, and I still need to revisit this, but that email function where I'm going to have an emailer that can use this to import, download, grab the video or grab the file, convert it, send it back. That's another great option. And one of the very last things before I go is I want to be able to set also a process instruction file, which might be a JSON file that gets added either through the form that's created or as an upload or maybe through forum input that will then dictate how this file gets processed, like auto creating aggregates or things based on certain blocks or containers based on some policy or based on what it sees in the data. So there might be something that we can do to further process the data to create it in the format we want the first time to, again, save time and effort moving forward. All right, thanks again. Have a great day. And if I don't come back and talk to you before then, I'll hopefully see you later in the week or weekend. Take care.